Everyone, welcome to Washington Focus. I'm Spencer Pauly, and I'm here talking with TJ Martinell, the Center Square's investigative reporter. TJ, thanks for coming on. Good to talk to you as always. But let's talk about a recent story of yours. So your article is about a Washington family of a man who was murdered by two teenagers over 2 decades ago. And now that family is speaking out against their potential early release. And we got a state House bill proposed this session that could allow these convicted killers to be released even earlier. Now, TJ, before we go into it, just because this case dates back to a 2004, right? Now, can you just give me a brief rundown of what happened? I mean, I was only a wee lad at that time, so I don't think I really recall what exactly occurred in 2004.
So what happened in 2004 is these two teenagers who were apparently part of a gang, stabbed a man named Bob Mars to death outside of the middle school where he worked as a 6th grade teacher. And they did so as part of a gang initiation. They were convicted of first-degree murder, which is as bad as it can be. And one of the guys was sentenced to 26 years. The other was sentenced to 29. And they both have petitioned to be released early through the Intermediate Sentence Review Board. So under Washington state laws that exist today, people can, who have been convicted as minors of this kind of stuff can petition 20 years after. So their petition was filed last year, and the family apparently was notified in October. So there's going to be a upcoming sentence hearing for one of them. I'm not sure when the other one is, but that's it's at least being considered. There is the possibility that they could be released early. So that, they're going to be roughly my age when they get out. So,
right. Well, this obviously raises alarms for the family of Bob, and you spoke with Chris Mars, his widow. Now, can you share me a bit about your conversation with her and just the impact that the situation has on her and the Mars family?
Yeah, I mean, I've never had a relative murdered, let alone a spouse. So I can't say what it would feel like, but yeah, she was under the impression 3 years ago when there was a resentencing hearing that was the end of the matter, that they were going to spend the next how many years in prison and they were going to serve out their sentence. But now she's being, having to deal with the fact that they can be released early. And granted, they weren't sentenced for life, so it's not like they were going to spend the rest of their lives in prison, but it's still the fact that they think they deserve to be let out early. And, her hope and expectations are not, it would be difficult for anyone to say that they are unreasonable. She just wants them to serve their full term. They were sentenced 26 years and 29 years, serve the 26 years and then 29 years.
Right.
Don't let them out early. And because she thinks it's not appropriate for what's going on or for what happened. Obviously, this wasn't a case. From what I've read of the case, this wasn't an instance where there was any ambiguity of what happened, and there was no reason for it. It was just they were being initiated into a gang, so they found a guy and murdered him on school grounds. Outside of his.
It's unreal to me, TJ, to think that an initiation to a game includes murdering people. That's just it's unreal to me. It's horrifying.
I think that's something that the Intermediate Sentence Review Board should consider, is the message that's going to send to people, is that I mean, this is just the reality in Washington State. If somebody is trying to kill you, unless they are killed outside the legal system, there's no circumstances, because we don't have the death penalty anymore. There's no circumstances under which that person is going to pay for their crime with their life unless someone goes outside the law. So that's where the person who wants to kill is in a position of has a high, I don't want to say high ground, but like they have an advantage over somebody who just wants to live, because that person knows that they will not be sentenced to death. And at worst, they'll spend the rest of their life in prison. But if you don't have a whole lot going on in life, granted, these were young kids at the time, but as she was pointing, Chris, his widow, was pointing out, how old do you have to be to understand that it's not okay to go stab someone to death? I'm pretty sure you don't have to be terribly old to realize that murdering people isn't okay. And there's these arguments she was discussing about how, oh, their frontal cortex isn't fully developed until 25. Well, okay. So if that's true, then why do we let them vote at 18? And why do we allow pre-registering voting at 17? And why do we allow them to drive a car at 15? Why do this is one of the things I find so interesting about Washington State. It is so scatterbrained when it comes to how old does somebody have to be to do something. You know, they're saying that until they're 25, they're not capable of understanding that it's not okay to stab someone.
I don't think we have to overthink that one, TJ, you know.
And you can get, so you can take out student loans that are not dischargeable upon bankruptcy at 18, but your frontal cortex isn't fully developed until 25. When they ban loans to people under a certain age, I'm gonna assume that they know what they're doing at age 18, or the other things that they let kids do underage without parental notice, consent, or knowledge or notification. So that's just where it's like, you know, there's a couple of analogies I could give, but we don't have to.
We have to keep it, you know, family friendly over here.
Yeah, unfortunately, the story's not a family friendly story, but yeah, that's pretty much what's going on. And the reason why this matters is because there was a bill. Aside from the family in question, there's a House Bill 1125 that was sponsored by Representative Tara Simmons, the first convicted felon to serve in Washington State Legislature. And that bill would have, if it passed, it would allow people like these two to apply after 7 years to be released early rather than 20. It didn't reach the House floor for a vote, but from what I've heard, there's going to be an attempt to have it reintroduced next session and try and get it passed. So what that means is that if a juvenile is trying to kill you and they succeed, they could potentially be out in as early as 7 years.
What's pushing lawmakers for these shorter sentences for juvenile offenders, especially with these extreme cases, right? When we talk about murder, I'm not quite sure why these laws are being proposed for like these drastic of cases.
I mean, we could delve into the psychological element of this, but I think part of it is, you know, Simmons has been a very staunch advocate for lack of a better word, staunch advocate for criminals. People who've been convicted of crimes, people who've been convicted of felonies. And so her legislation has very much been focused on, I mean, for example, she wanted to expand gun rights for convicted felons. And this is so, and I have emails of her saying she would prefer there be no guns in our society, but if there's going to be guns, she wants people who've been convicted of felonies to get their access to guns restored. So that's where convicted felons' rights upon release from prison, it overlaps any other priorities in that case. So that's what's going on here. And it's all, one could argue that they're almost treating criminals like they're the victims of a system rather than the perpetrators of behavior like this, where there's really no excuse. The behavior that got them there in the first place when we're talking, right? Yeah. I would be very interested to have someone get up and make the argument that these kids were oppressed or they were part of an oppressive institutional system that put them in this position. This is this is the part where people talk about how people in desperate positions turn to crime. They didn't even, I don't think they tried to steal anything. They just killed them because that they wanted to join a gang. So, right. And I think the question the board should think about is, what has this murder done insofar as they're standing with this gang? Because they probably went to prison and they've gained status within a gang. So when they get released, their highest status is going to be that they engaged in gang initiation. So my guess is if that gang's still around, if it's any kind of formal gang, they're going to have status, you know?
Well, TJ, when we're talking about like the ISRB's process for reviewing early release petitions, I'm wondering what factors do they consider when deciding whether to grant early release? Is it just good behavior? Do they relook at the case?
Probably good behavior, what their conduct in prison, any signs that they've shown any kind of remorse or something like that. But I mean, that's the ideal is what you look at. The question of like, were they young and they didn't know what in this case, it's almost difficult to ignore the facts. Like this wasn't they got into a spat with another gang and shot somebody because they thought that the other gang was going to show up at their house and kill them. Like that's where one could argue that at that young age, there's a bit of wiggle room, but we're talking about somebody who was just minding their own business, not doing anything wrong, wasn't part of a gang, wasn't committing any crime, was just at his place of work and was stabbed to death. It's going to be difficult for, in my view, if I was on the board, my biggest concern would be when they're released, their highest status will be as part of a gang. So what are they going to do once they're released? And that's actually a question I asked Bob Mars's widow, Chris, is like, are you trying to make sure this doesn't happen again? Or are you also just trying to see that justice is served? And she said both. Like she wants them to serve their full sentences, but also, she knows her belief is that they come from violent backgrounds and this is kind of what their families are about. So,
right. So you get released into that environment again.
Right. And so I think that's what the question the board's got to ask is like, what is the purpose of releasing them early?
Mm-hmm. Well, with the ISRB hearing scheduled for July and February of next year, are you planning to follow up on the story, or are there any developments you're anticipating here, TJ?
Yeah, there's going to be a community concern hearing in Lacey later this month, and that's because of just the enormous amount of public interest in this case. I think it's because frankly, it's such a clear-cut case of you would be hard pressed to have someone say to defend, justify, or rationalize this behavior. It's such a clear cut case. There's no ambiguity whatsoever. There's no debate. There's no discussion. A guy was murdered for no reason whatsoever by two teenagers who had no reason other than they just committed a heinous crime. So the question is, why is their petition even being considered? As opposed to somebody where there were extenuating circumstances or it was a very unusual situation. This is one of the most unambiguous cases of just, I can't imagine the jury spent a lot of time thinking about whether or not they were guilty. I think that was, if there was a jury, I'm not sure if they pled, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens after the community concern hearing.
Now, that community concern hearing, there's so much public interest in it, but the public cannot attend, correct? I noticed that in the story.
As of right now, the public can't attend. Friends of Bob Mars and his family can attend.
Is that standard?
That's standard. That might change. I'm not sure because of this case where I think it's very interesting that I find it very... as a citizen and a taxpayer, I find it very weird that a hearing over whether or not some two murderers should be released into a community shouldn't allow. Why should that not allow the public who might have to deal with these guys? They might be living in their neighborhoods. They might be going, your spouse could be the next person on their list potentially.
Yeah.
So you think that the public would say, yeah, or not the public would say, but that they would understand the public has a right to know this stuff and they have a right to ask questions.
Right.
Saying only friends and family. Well, guess what? Friends and family aren't the only ones who are going to be affected if these two killers are released from prison. Well,
TJ, we'll have to see what happens, and know you'll be on top of it and put out a story, inform our readers. And for that, I'll say thanks again for talking to me about this, and for viewers at home, see you next week.